Emily shivered as the bus rumbled through the dense woods lining the outskirts of Havensbrook. The trees, tall and gnarled, twisted together like skeletal fingers grasping at the dim sky. The sun had long dipped behind the horizon, leaving only a faint purplish glow that filtered through the branches, casting eerie shadows over the dirt road. The bus, an ancient rickety vehicle with peeling paint and grimy windows, felt like it was carrying her backward in time. As the bus drew closer to town, Emily couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. It had been years since she last set foot in Havensbrook, the town where she was born and raised until her parents' untimely death when she was just a child. Returning now after all this time felt like stepping into the past, a past filled with half-forgotten memories, most of them tinged with sadness and darkness. She had no choice but to return. Her only living relative, Uncle Victor, had insisted that she come back. The man had been a shadow in her life, never visiting, never calling, yet his letter had arrived out of nowhere, an unsettlingly formal request for her to stay at the family mansion. He was dying, he claimed, and wanted to see her one last time. But there was something more in his words, something unspoken that gnawed at her. A sense of urgency, as if this wasn't just a request, it was a summons. The bus wheezed to a stop at Havensbrook's tiny station, a rundown structure that hadn't changed since she left. The driver gave her a curt nod, barely acknowledging her as she stepped off the bus. The air was thick with the smell of decaying leaves, and the silence that enveloped the town was suffocating. Even the wind seemed to carry an ominous weight, as if it was trying to warn her of something she couldn't yet understand. Emily pulled her coat tighter around herself as she made her way down the narrow, winding streets. Havensbrook was a town lost to time. The cobblestone paths, the flickering gaslit lamps, the looming Victorian houses. Everything was a relic of the past. The townspeople, those few she glimpsed from behind half-closed curtains, watched her with wary eyes, as if they knew she didn't belong here anymore, as if they knew something she didn't. As she walked, memories of her childhood in Havensbrook flooded back. She had loved this town once, its quiet charm, its rich history, but there had always been something off. The whispered rumors of strange happenings, the stories the older kids told about people who had vanished without a trace. And then there was her family. The others had always kept their distance from the Kellers, as if they were tainted by something unspoken, something ancient. Her thoughts turned to the mansion that waited for her at the edge of town. The Keller mansion had stood for centuries, a crumbling Gothic monstrosity that seemed to loom over the town like a dark sentinel. It had been the backdrop of her nightmares as a child, its long, twisting hallways and cold, empty rooms. She remembered running down those halls, her footsteps echoing like gunshots in the silence, always feeling like something was following her, watching her. And then there was the accident. Her parents' death. She had been too young to understand the details, but she knew it had been violent, mysterious. The police had called it an accident, but the whispers around town had said otherwise. Emily had never asked, never dared to dig deeper into the murky truth of it. But now, returning to Havensbrook, the memories resurfaced like bodies rising from a dark lake, bloated and terrible. She arrived at the mansion as dusk settled over the town, the sky now an inky black dotted with a few dim stars. The mansion loomed before her, more decrepit than she remembered, its once grand facade cracked and weathered. The iron gates creaked open with a sound that made her wince. As she stepped inside the courtyard, the chill in the air deepened and an oppressive heaviness settled over her, making it harder to breathe. The front door groaned as she pushed it open. The inside of the mansion was even worse than she had feared. Dust coated every surface, and the air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long, as if the darkness was alive and waiting. And the silence. The silence was unbearable. It was the kind of silence that felt like it was listening, waiting for something to break it. Emily. The voice was a raspy whisper, barely more than a breath, but it made her jump. She turned to see Uncle Victor standing in the doorway of the parlor, his frail form barely illuminated by the flickering candle he held. He looked worse than she had imagined, thin, gaunt, his skin stretched tightly over his bones. His eyes, though, were still sharp, glinting with something she couldn't place. "Uncle," she said, her voice trembling despite her attempt to keep it steady. "I got your letter." He nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on her as if weighing her every movement, every breath. "You shouldn't have come back." The words hit her like a slap, cold and cruel. "But you asked me to." "I know," he said softly, stepping closer. "But it was a mistake. You should never have come back to Havensbrook, especially not now." Emily swallowed, her throat tight. "What do you mean?" "Why now?" Victor didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned and gestured for her to follow him into the parlor. She hesitated, the darkness of the room beyond making her stomach twist in knots. But she followed him, the soft creak of the floorboards beneath her feet making her skin crawl. As they entered the room, Victor lit more candles, their flickering light casting grotesque shadows on the walls. "There's a reason the Kellers are hated here," Victor said, his voice barely above a whisper. "A reason why people fear this house." Emily stared at him, confusion and unease warring in her mind. "What are you talking about?" He sank into an old armchair, his bony hands trembling. "This town, Havensbrook, it's not like other places. There's something here, something ancient and evil. The Kellers, our family, we've been its keepers for centuries, and now it's awakening again." Her blood ran cold at his words, but before she could ask more, a soft, almost imperceptible noise interrupted the silence. A faint scratching sound coming from deep within the house, as if something or someone was clawing at the walls, trying to escape. Victor's eyes widened in fear, his thin lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. Instead, he slumped back in the chair, his breath shallow and ragged. Emily turned toward the sound, her heart hammering in her chest. She had always known Havensbrook was strange, that her family's history was shrouded in mystery, but she had never imagined anything like this. The scratching grew louder. The days passed in a blur of growing unease. Each morning, Emily would wake to a hollow silence that hung in the air like a specter, a silence that seemed almost too thick for such an old house. The shadows in the mansion felt darker than they should be, too long, too deep. It was as though the house itself was alive, watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake. And then, always in the background, there was the faint, maddening scratching from deep within the walls. Victor had grown more distant since her arrival, retreating to his quarters, refusing to speak of the chilling words he had spoken the night she arrived. His health was failing rapidly, his once sharp mind drifting in and out of lucidity. His warnings, cryptic as they had been, echoed in her head, making it impossible to rest. Something ancient and evil, he had said, and each day Emily felt herself being drawn deeper into whatever dark mystery her family was entangled in. It was on the fifth night, just after dusk, that Emily made a discovery that would change everything. The rain had come in fierce that afternoon, and the sky was bruised with thick, roiling clouds. The mansion seemed to groan under the weight of the storm, the wind howling through the broken window panes like a banshee wailing in the night. The flickering candlelight cast grotesque shapes across the walls, transforming the antique furniture into lurking figures. Alone, Emily wandered through the winding halls of the mansion, seeking an answer to the growing sense of dread that gnawed at her. The house was a maze, an endless series of rooms connected by narrow corridors that twisted and turned with no logical direction. Most of the rooms were filled with dust-covered relics from long-forgotten generations of her family, but none held the answers she sought. It wasn't until she found herself in the mansion's basement, a place she had always been forbidden to explore as a child, that she began to piece together the terrifying truth. The basement was colder than the rest of the house, and as Emily descended the stone steps, the air became thick and damp. The walls were lined with old portraits of stern-faced ancestors, their eyes following her every move. The scent of earth and mildew filled her nostrils, and the deeper she went, the more oppressive the air became, as if the mansion itself was trying to push her back, to keep her away from whatever secrets lay beneath. At the bottom of the staircase, Emily found a small room, its door slightly ajar. It was cluttered with boxes of old documents and broken furniture, the remains of a life long past. But it wasn't the room itself that caught her attention. It was what lay behind it. There, tucked into the far corner, was a massive dust-covered bookshelf. Unlike the others she had seen throughout the house, this one had no books. Instead, it seemed to be concealing something. The wood was warped and cracked as though it had been untouched for decades. But behind it, Emily could make out the faint outline of a door. Her heart raced. She hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to turn back, to leave whatever secrets lay behind that door undisturbed. But she couldn't shake the feeling that this was what Victor had been trying to warn her about. The truth lay beyond this door, and she had to know. Summoning every ounce of courage, she pushed the bookshelf aside, its weight heavier than she expected, and revealed the hidden door. It was ancient, made of thick wood reinforced with iron bars, and the air that seeped out from behind it was colder still, like the breath of the grave. Emily's hands shook as she gripped the handle, the metal cold against her skin. It resisted at first, as though something on the other side was trying to hold it shut, but after a moment it gave way with a groan, the hinges creaking in protest. The door swung open slowly, revealing a dark passage that led deeper into the earth. She stood at the threshold, staring into the inky blackness. The walls were lined with damp stone, slick with moisture, and the air reeked of something ancient and decayed. A single flickering light bulb hung from the ceiling, barely illuminating the narrow staircase that spiraled down into the depths. Without another thought, Emily stepped inside. The further she descended, the heavier the air became. It was as if the earth was closing in around her, the weight of centuries pressing down on her chest. The darkness seemed to swallow her whole, the light from her flashlight flickering, struggling to cut through the thick gloom. The walls were slick and cold to the touch, and she could hear the faint drip of water echoing through the narrow passageway. As she reached the bottom of the staircase, she found herself standing in a vast, open chamber. far larger than the mansion above. The walls were lined with strange symbols, ancient cryptic markings that glowed faintly in the dim light, as though they were alive. In the center of the room was a stone altar, blackened with age, and surrounding it were piles of bones, human and animal alike, scattered across the floor like the remnants of some dark ritual. Her breath caught in her throat as she stepped closer to the altar. There, etched into the stone, was a symbol she recognized from her family's crest, a twisted, distorted version of it, as though it had been corrupted by something far older and darker than she could imagine. Her pulse quickened as she realized what she was looking at. This was no ordinary chamber. This was a tomb. Suddenly she heard a noise, a soft, scuttling sound that seemed to come from behind the walls, as if something was moving just out of sight. The scratching sound she had heard for days was louder now, more insistent, and as she looked around the chamber, she saw it. A crack in the wall, barely visible, but large enough for her to see that it wasn't a solid stone wall at all. It was a doorway, sealed long ago. Her heart pounded in her chest as she knelt to inspect the crack. The air that seeped through it was cold, colder than the rest of the chamber, and it carried with it a faint, sickly sweet scent, like the smell of decay. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. What had her family been hiding down here? What had they sealed away so long ago? Without thinking, Emily pressed her hands against the stone and pushed. The crack widened slightly, just enough for her to see what lay beyond. And then she saw it. The faint glint of pale skin, the outline of a hand, impossibly long fingers curled into a grotesque claw. It was too dark to see clearly, but she could feel its presence. Something was behind that wall, something alive, and it was waiting to be set free. She stumbled back, her flashlight flickering wildly as the scratching grew louder. Whatever was behind that wall was waking up, its presence filling the chamber with an overwhelming sense of dread. Emily's mind raced with panic. She had to get out, had to leave this place before it was too late. But as she turned to flee, the ground beneath her feet trembled, and the ancient walls groaned with the sound of something far older and far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. Her family's darkest secret was not just the mansion itself, it was what had been buried beneath it. And now she had unlocked the door to something that was never meant to be found. The scratching stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. It was the kind of silence that made her skin crawl, the kind that felt like it was watching her, breathing down her neck. Emily fled up the stairs, her heart hammering in her chest, but she knew, deep down, that whatever she had found in that chamber wasn't going to stay sealed for long. Emily sat at the old wooden desk in her bedroom, her hands trembling as she tried to steady her breathing. The journal she had found in the basement lay open before her, its brittle pages yellowed with age. The words written in a shaky hand detailed horrors she could barely comprehend, rituals, sacrifices, and the dark lineage of the Keller family. But the part that terrified her the most was the warning at the end. The blood calls to them. The darkness must never awaken. It was already too late. Since the night she discovered the underground chamber, the mansion had changed. The house itself seemed to hum with a low, barely perceptible vibration, as if something beneath the surface was stirring. The air was colder now, the shadows thicker. Doors that had once led to familiar rooms now opened to darkened hallways that twisted and stretched into spaces that shouldn't exist. It was as though the mansion was warping, its reality bending in response to whatever she had unleashed. Victor, once bedridden and frail, had become even more distant, his eyes glazed over as he muttered incomprehensible things. He rarely left his room, and when he did, he would shuffle through the halls with a vacant expression, mumbling to himself about the coming night. Emily had tried to speak to him to get answers, but he was too far gone, lost in the madness that had gripped him for years. And then there were the dreams. Every night since her discovery, Emily had been plagued by nightmares. In them, she was always running through the mansion's endless corridors, chased by shadows with glowing red eyes and mouths filled with jagged teeth. The whispers in her dreams were growing louder, more insistent. They called her by name, beckoning her to return to the chamber, to accept the truth of her family's legacy. She awoke each night drenched in sweat, her heart racing, the feeling of being watched lingering even after she opened her eyes. But what haunted her most was the sensation that something else was moving inside the house. She could hear it at night, the faint sound of footsteps echoing through the halls, the soft scrape of nails against the walls. She had tried to convince herself that it was her imagination, that her mind was playing tricks on her, but she knew better. Something had woken beneath the mansion, something hungry. It was Halloween night when everything began to unravel. The air outside was still, unnaturally quiet for a town that usually celebrated the holiday with bonfires and costumes. This year, though, Havensbrook was different. The townspeople had become even more reclusive than before, closing their doors and windows tightly, as if afraid of what might come with the night. Emily had noticed it during her few trips into town, how people seemed to avoid her gaze, how the whispers grew quieter when she passed by. She could feel their fear, but she couldn't tell if it was directed at her or at the thing that was now haunting her family's mansion. That night, the wind outside howled with a ferocity she had never heard before. The old house groaned and creaked under the pressure, but it wasn't the wind that terrified her. It was the silence that followed it. For hours, the house had been deathly quiet. No footsteps, no scratching, just a heavy, oppressive silence that felt like the calm before a storm. Victor had summoned her to his room earlier in the evening, his voice weak and barely above a whisper. When she entered, she found him sitting upright in his bed, his eyes glowing with a feverish intensity. "They're coming for you," he had said, his voice trembling with fear. "The blood. You're the last of us. They need you, Emily. You're the key." She had begged him to explain, but his words became more incoherent, his thoughts slipping away into madness. "The darkness. It's always been here, waiting. The Kellers were chosen, you see, to protect it, to feed it." He had grabbed her arm with surprising strength, his bony fingers digging into her skin. "You must not let them in. If they rise, it will be the end. They'll feed on us all." And then he had collapsed, his body shaking violently as he muttered about the awakening. Emily had fled his room, her heart racing, her mind reeling. She felt trapped, caught in a nightmare she couldn't escape. Every instinct told her to run, to leave Havensbrook and never return. But deep down, she knew that it was too late. She had woken something that couldn't be undone. As the clock struck midnight, the first sound came, a low, guttural groan that seemed to rise up from the very foundations of the house. Emily froze, her body rigid with fear. The groan echoed through the walls, growing louder, deeper, until it felt like the mansion itself was breathing. She clutched the edge of the desk, her knuckles white, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Emily grabbed the flashlight from her bedside table and bolted from the room. The air in the hallway was thick, like wading through a dense fog. The walls seemed to pulse, the shadows stretching and contorting in unnatural ways. Her footsteps echoed unnervingly, as though the house was amplifying the sound, mocking her attempts to escape. The mansion was collapsing around her. The very walls that had once stood tall and impenetrable now groaned and cracked under the weight of the darkness that had been awakened beneath. Every breath Emily took was a battle, the air thick with dust, fear, and something more, something ancient and malevolent. She could feel it in her bones, in the marrow of her very being. The darkness had taken root in her, and it wasn't going to let go. She had been a fool to think she could escape. The truth of her family's dark legacy had been buried so deeply, twisted into the very foundations of Havensbrook, and now it was unraveling before her eyes. The Kellers had been protectors, not of the town, not of its people, but of the ancient evil that had slumbered beneath the earth. And she, the last of her cursed bloodline, was the key to its release. The shadows moved unnaturally now, warping into grotesque shapes that clawed at her as she ran. The house itself seemed alive, pulsing with a dark energy that twisted space and time. Every hallway stretched impossibly long, every turn leading her deeper into the labyrinth. It was as though the mansion was conspiring with the thing that hunted her, trying to trap her, to consume her whole. But Emily wasn't going to let it win. Her chest heaved with effort, her heart racing in her throat. The basement. It all started there, and it would end there. She had to destroy the altar, the heart of whatever dark power her family had been feeding for centuries. The realization had come too late, but there was no turning back now. If she could sever the connection, maybe, just maybe, she could stop the darkness from consuming everything. She reached the top of the basement stairs, her hand gripping the banister to steady herself. The door to the basement stood ajar, the blackness yawning below like the mouth of some forgotten abyss. Emily's flashlight had long since flickered out, and the only light left was the faint, ghostly glow that seemed to emanate from the cracks in the walls. It was the glow of something ancient and hungry, calling her back down into the heart of the darkness. Her legs shook as she descended the steps, each creak of the wood beneath her feet echoing like the tolling of a bell. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her throat dry, but she forced herself to keep moving. The stone walls were damp, slick with moisture, and the air grew colder with every step until it felt as though the life was being sucked out of the room itself. At the bottom of the stairs, the chamber awaited her. The altar stood in the center, bathed in that same sickly, pulsing light. It was ancient, cracked with age, and yet it thrummed with power. The symbols carved into its surface seemed to writhe in the dim glow, alive with the blood of centuries. The bones that had littered the floor before were gone now, disappeared into the earth or consumed by the darkness. Emily's heart clenched as she realized that the ritual was nearing completion. The vampire stood on the far side of the altar, its red eyes glowing like embers in the shadows. It smiled that grotesque, too-wide smile, revealing rows of jagged teeth, and spoke in a voice that was not its own, but something far older. "You cannot stop what has already begun." Emily's body trembled, her limbs feeling weak, but she gritted her teeth, forcing herself to step forward. "I can," she whispered, her voice barely audible but filled with determination. "I will." Her eyes darted to the altar, It was the source. The Kellers had been feeding it for centuries, and now it was time to starve it. She just had to destroy it, had to break the connection. But as she moved, the vampire stepped into her path, its grotesque figure blocking her way, towering over her like a shadow of death. "You belong to us, Emily," it hissed. "You are the last of your kind. This is your legacy." "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "It's not." She lunged, her hands gripping a shard of broken stone from the floor, and swung it with all the force she could muster. The vampire's speed was inhuman, but it hadn't expected her to fight back. The stone connected with its face, a sickening crunch as its head snapped to the side. The creature snarled, its red eyes flaring with anger, but Emily didn't stop. She ran for the altar, her breath coming in shallow gasps, her vision narrowing to a single point of focus. She had to end this. With a scream, she slammed the stone into the altar, again and again, her hands numb with the force of the blows. The symbols carved into the surface glowed brighter, pulsing with an unnatural light, but the cracks began to spread. The ground beneath her feet trembled, and the walls of the chamber groaned as if the very foundation of the mansion was giving way. The vampire howled in rage behind her, but it was too late. The altar shattered with a deafening crack, the stone splintering into 1,000 pieces. The light flickered, dimming, then exploded in a burst of darkness that swallowed the chamber whole. Emily was thrown back, her body slamming against the cold stone floor as the ground beneath her gave way. For a moment there was nothing. No sound, no light, only silence and the feeling of falling into a vast, endless void. And then, slowly, Emily opened her eyes. The chamber was gone. The altar was gone. The vampire, too, had disappeared, its presence erased from the world as if it had never existed. The air was still, heavy with the scent of earth and decay, but the oppressive weight that had filled the mansion was lifted. The darkness was gone, severed from its anchor, cast back into whatever hell it had come from. Emily lay there, staring up at the fractured ceiling, her body aching, her mind numb with exhaustion. She had done it. She had stopped the ritual. She had broken the curse. But as she lay there in the wreckage, a single thought clawed its way into her mind, one that sent a chill racing down her spine. The darkness was never truly gone. It had only been buried. And in the shadows of Havensbrook, where the wind whispered through the trees and the shadows stretched long, something was still waiting for its chance to rise again. As Emily dragged herself to her feet and made her way toward the light, she knew that the town would never truly be safe. The darkness was patient. It could wait. And though she had escaped, she could never outrun the truth. The legacy of the Kellers would live on, and the darkness would always find a way back.